Did you know that religious texts shaped women's lives for centuries? Ever wonder how medieval women were told to behave? Could you imagine having your entire existence dictated by ancient manuscripts? Number 1. The Book of the Knight of the Tower, Raising Perfect Daughters. The year was 1371. A French nobleman sat down to write a guidebook for his daughters. Geoffrey de la Tour Landry created what would become one of the most influential medieval texts on female behavior, the Book of the Knight of the Tower. This wasn't just any father's advice. It was a comprehensive handbook that would be translated into multiple languages and shape feminine ideals for centuries. Geoffrey had lost his wife and wanted to ensure his daughters grew up to be proper, noble women. His solution: a collection of cautionary tales and moral lessons specifically designed for young girls. The book wasn't subtle about its intentions. It explicitly told girls how to dress, speak, pray, and behave in public and private. One particularly striking story warns about the dangers of vanity. A noblewoman who spent too much time admiring herself in the mirror was punished by having the devil appear in her reflection. Another tale recounts how a woman who wore revealing clothing was struck by lightning as divine punishment. Physical appearance was clearly a major concern, but the Book of the Knight went beyond appearances. It instructed women to remain silent in public, to avoid looking men in the eyes, and to be completely obedient to their husband. Chastity wasn't just recommended. It was portrayed as the defining virtue of womanhood. Women who failed to maintain their purity faced social ostracism in this life and eternal punishment in the next. What made this text so powerful wasn't just its content, but its widespread distribution. After being translated from French into English by William Caxton in 1484, it found its way into noble households across Europe. Young women from aristocratic families would have these lessons drilled into them from childhood, shaping their understanding of their role in society before they could form their own opinions. Number 2. The Malleus Maleficarum, Fear and Control. Have you ever heard about the book that fueled witch hunts across Europe? The Malleus Maleficarum, meaning the Hammer of Witches, was published in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. While not exclusively focused on regulating female behavior, this infamous text had profound and terrifying implications for women in medieval society. The Malleus explicitly stated that women were more susceptible to demonic influence than men. According to Kramer and Sprenger, women were intellectually like children, physically weaker and morally inferior. These supposed weaknesses made them perfect targets for the devil's corruption. The authors didn't mince words. All wickedness is but little to the wickedness of a woman. The text provided detailed instructions on how to identify, interrogate, and prosecute witches. Physical characteristics that might mark a woman as a witch included birthmarks, moles, or even unusual beauty. Behavioral traits like being outspoken, knowledgeable about herbal medicine, or living alone could trigger suspicion. In a society guided by these principles, women faced an impossible situation: conform completely to submissive ideals or risk being accused of witchcraft. What made the Malleus particularly effective as a control mechanism was its official status. Pope Innocent VIII authorized the text with a papal bull, giving it the weight of church authority. While some clergy criticized the book, it still sold more copies than any book except the Bible for nearly 200 years. Thousands of copies circulated throughout Europe, influencing judges, priests, and community leaders who held power over women's lives. The fear instilled by this text was profound. Women knew that stepping outside prescribed boundaries could result in torture and execution. Midwives, widows, and women with knowledge of healing, those with some degree of independence or authority, faced particular scrutiny. The result was a society where women policed their own behavior out of sheer terror, restricting their movements, speech, and knowledge to avoid suspicion. Number 3. The Ancrene Wisse, Guidelines for Holy Women. Imagine choosing to be walled into a small room attached to a church for the rest of your life. This was the path of anchoresses, women who chose extreme religious seclusion in medieval England. For these women, every aspect of daily life was prescribed in a remarkable text called the Ancrene Wisse, or Guide for Anchoresses, written in the early 13th century. The Ancrene Wisse was composed in Middle English by an anonymous author, likely a male religious figure, specifically for 3 noble sisters who had chosen the anchoritic life. The text provided exhaustingly detailed instructions on everything from prayer schedules to appropriate thoughts. It divided life into inner and outer rules, but both were equally constraining. Physical isolation was paramount. The anchoress lived in a cell with 3 windows, one facing the church altar, one for receiving food and necessities, and one small window to the outside world through which she could offer counsel. The Ancrene Wisse warned against the dangers of this last window. The anchoress who shows herself at the window is like a bird in a cage. Women were told to avoid looking outside, speaking unnecessarily to visitors, or developing attachments to the world. Even within their tiny cells, these women weren't free from behavioral constraints. The text dictated proper sleeping positions, eating habits, and even thoughts. Anchoresses were instructed to imagine their cell as Christ's tomb, their bed as their grave, and to mentally prepare for death daily. Self-mortification was encouraged through fasting, wearing uncomfortable clothing, and strict prayer schedules that interrupted sleep. What's particularly fascinating about the Ancrene Wisse is how it controlled even the internal lives of women. The author provided scripts for confession, models for meditation, and detailed descriptions of appropriate emotional responses to religious contemplation. The text explicitly states that female nature requires more regulation than male, claiming women are more susceptible to sin and therefore need stricter guidelines. Despite these constraints, women continued to choose anchoritic life throughout the medieval period. Some historians suggest this, paradoxically, provided a form of independence. Once enclosed, an anchoress was free from marriage expectations and male household authority. The Ancrene Wisse offers a window into a world where even women seeking spiritual devotion found their behaviors prescribed in minute detail. Number 4. La Cité des Dames, a remarkable exception. In the early 15th century, something extraordinary happened in the world of texts dictating female behavior. A woman picked up her pen to challenge prevailing views. Christine de Pizan wrote The Book of the City of Ladies in 1405, creating a work that stood in stark contrast to most religious and secular literature of the time. Born in Venice and raised in the French court, Christine received an unusual education for a medieval woman. After her husband's death left her with 3 children to support, she became the first professional female writer in Europe. Her City of Ladies was a direct response to misogynistic texts like Jean de Meun's portion of the Roman de la Rose, which portrayed women as inherently deceptive and immoral. Christine's text takes the form of an allegorical dream vision in which 3 virtues, reason, rectitude, and justice, help her build a metaphorical city populated by history's most virtuous women. Through this framework, she systematically refuted common claims about women's inferiority. When texts like the Malleus Maleficarum claimed women were intellectually deficient, Christine countered with examples of female scholars and wise rulers. What makes this text particularly significant is its engagement with religious authorities. Christine directly challenged interpretations of Scripture that positioned women as subordinate, reinterpreting biblical passages to emphasize female virtue and importance. She argued that God created women and men equal in soul, even if different in body, and that women's education should be prioritized rather than suppressed. Despite its revolutionary content, Christine's work remained firmly religious. She didn't reject Christianity, but reinterpreted it through a female perspective. She emphasized stories of female martyrs and saints, arguing that women had always been essential to Christian history. This allowed her work to circulate in religious circles, while subtly undermining the behavioral restrictions placed on women. The City of Ladies wasn't as widely distributed as texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, but it found readers across Europe, particularly among noble women who had access to books. Its existence proves that even in the medieval period, the conversation about women's nature and proper behavior wasn't entirely one-sided. In a world dominated by texts telling women how to behave, Christine offered an alternative vision based on female excellence and capability. Number 5. The Rule of Saint Benedict, Monastic Guideline. Behind the high stone walls of medieval convents, thousands of women lived according to ancient rules that dictated their every action. The most influential of these was the Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, for monks but adapted for female religious communities throughout the medieval period. Benedict's rule wasn't originally intended for women. It was created to govern male monastic communities, outlining a structured life of prayer work and communal living. However, by the early medieval period, female religious houses began adopting and adapting these guidelines. The rule's emphasis on obedience, humility, and stability particularly shaped nuns' behavior. The daily life of a Benedictine nun was rigidly structured. The rule divided the day into 8 prayer services, beginning with matins in the middle of the night and ending with compline before bed. Between these services, women engaged in prescribed work, study, and communal meals, all conducted in specific ways detailed by the rule. Even sleeping arrangements were regulated, with nuns required to sleep clothed in communal dormitories, with a lamp burning all night. Silence formed a cornerstone of behavioral control in female monasteries. The rule states, speaking and teaching belong to the mistress. The disciple's part is to be silent and to listen. This principle was applied even more strictly in women's communities than men's, with many convents enforcing complete silence except during specific permitted periods. A woman who spoke out of turn might face public penance or physical punishment. The concept of enclosed space took on particular significance for female religious communities. While male monasteries allowed monks some freedom of movement for work or preaching, nuns were increasingly enclosed, physically separated from the outside world by walls, grills, and strict regulations. By the 13th century, papal decrees like Periculoso made this enclosure mandatory for all female religious orders, citing the need to protect women's chastity and prevent scandal. Despite these restrictions, many women actively chose convent life. For some, it offered education, leadership, opportunities, and freedom from marital obligations unavailable elsewhere in medieval society. Female religious communities developed their own interpretations of the rule, sometimes softening its harsher aspects or emphasizing different elements than male communities. The existence of female-authored commentaries on the rule shows that women weren't merely passive recipients of behavioral dictates, but engaged interpreters of their religious traditions. Number 6. Tertullian's On the Apparel of Women. Ancient Roots. The medieval constraints on female behavior didn't emerge from nowhere. They had deep roots in early Christian writings, like Tertullian's on the apparel of women. Composed around 200 CE, this ancient text continued to influence medieval attitudes, being copied, quoted, and expanded upon by religious authorities throughout the Middle Ages. Tertullian, an early Christian writer from Carthage, aimed his sharp rhetoric directly at female vanity. He declared that women's beauty was dangerous, not just to men who might be tempted, but to the women themselves. "You are the devil's gateway," he famously told his female audience, connecting women to Eve's original sin and suggesting their nature was inherently more corrupt than men's. His instructions were explicit and detailed. Women should avoid jewelry, colored fabrics, elaborate hairstyles, and cosmetics. Natural appearance wasn't enough. Women needed to actively minimize their attractiveness through plain dress and downcast eyes. Tertullian's concern wasn't merely physical modesty, but a deeper spiritual issue. He believed women's souls were at stake, writing that the more they ornament themselves, the more they destroy themselves. What made this text particularly powerful in the medieval period was its integration into canonical collections of church teachings. Church fathers like Jerome and Augustine echoed Tertullian's sentiments, creating a consistent message about female appearance and behavior that carried tremendous theological weight. Medieval preachers regularly incorporated these ideas into sermons, ensuring they reached women of all social classes, not just those who could read. The practical impact was profound. Women who wished to be considered pious in medieval society adopted these guidelines, covering their hair with veils or wimples, wearing modest colors, and avoiding ornamentation. Those who didn't faced public censure, often delivered by parish priests who cited Tertullian and similar authorities in condemning immodest women. While Tertullian's text predates the medieval period by centuries, its persistence demonstrates how religious ideas about female behavior solidified over time into rigid social expectation. The medieval church didn't invent restrictions on women, but inherited, systematized, and enforced concepts developed in Christianity's earliest centuries. Number 7. The Golden Legend: Saints as Behavioral Models. Can a collection of saints' lives function as a behavior manual? For medieval women, Jacobus de Voragines' Golden Legend, compiled around 1260, served precisely this purpose. This wildly popular text presented female saints as models for ordinary women to emulate, though their extreme sacrifices set an impossible standard. The Golden Legend was the medieval equivalent of a bestseller. With over 1,000 manuscript copies surviving today, it was second only to the Bible in popularity. Its influence extended beyond the literate elite through artwork inspired by these stories and priests who incorporated these tales into sermons. The text presented detailed accounts of saints' lives, focusing on their miracles, martyrdoms, and extreme devotion. For women, the female saints presented in the Golden Legend offered powerful but problematic role models. Saint Agnes, martyred at age 13 for refusing marriage and maintaining her virginity, taught girls that death was preferable to lost purity. Saint Margaret, who defeated a dragon while imprisoned for her faith, demonstrated that spiritual strength could overcome physical weakness, a quality the text explicitly associated with femininity. The behavioral ideal that emerges from these stories is one of constant resistance to bodily desires. Saint Mary of Egypt, a reformed prostitute who lived alone in the desert for 47 years, exemplified the transformation from sexual sin to extreme asceticism. Saint Catherine of Alexandria used her education to debate philosophers, but ultimately embraced martyrdom rather than marriage. These women were praised specifically for rejecting typical female roles and bodily needs. What's particularly striking about the Golden Legend is how it glorifies physical suffering as specifically appropriate for women. Female saints in these stories endure graphic tortures with supernatural calm, have their breasts cut off, are stripped naked in public, or voluntarily inflict pain on themselves through fasting, hair shirts, and self-flagellation. For medieval women hearing these stories, the message was clear. Holiness required rejecting not just sin, but their physical bodies. Despite the extremity of these examples, evidence suggests ordinary women did attempt to incorporate elements of saints' behavior into their lives. Records show women adopting fasting practices, secretly wearing uncomfortable garments under their clothes, or choosing religious life over marriage. The saints of the Golden Legend might have been extraordinary, but their influence on everyday female behavior was very real. Have you ever stopped to wonder how these ancient texts still echo in our society today? Can we truly understand modern gender expectations without acknowledging their medieval religious roots?